that sold.
Who was the editor of that?
Oh, I have no idea. But it was appropriate that it was Asimov. I mean, I actually did the last interview with Isaac Asimov for the Sci-Fi magazine. And they wanted me to do an interview with Isaac Asimov. Why they chose me, I have no idea. But the thing was, at the time, Asimov was on his way out. He had a very, he said he would do the interview, but he was very explicit that I could not bring the camera. And when I went there, I understood why, because he was so thin. And, he was dying of AIDS. And at the time, nobody knew that. But he was so thin, and he had no energy whatsoever, except for one moment when I brought up Reagan, right? And he was sitting in this chair, and he starts talking about Reagan and the idiocy of Reagan's people, and his voice started to rise, and he became so angry, and he was pounding on the chair like this, those idiots, and they're, just banging on it, and it's like, okay, Isaac Asimov is back in the room. That was so cool. My best Asimov story, years and years and years ago, I was like in my early 20s. And my then wife and I were at Penn Station. We were waiting for a train. And it was April 1st. And at one point, my wife suddenly says, "Oh, look, it's Ben Bova." And I turned, and she says, "April Fool." And I went, "Seriously?" Yeah, that's hilarious. And then she goes off to the restroom. And who walks past me but Isaac Asimov? And I said, "Dr. Asimov, good to see you." And he says, "Good to see you." And he keeps right on walking. My then wife comes back, and I said, "You won't believe this. Isaac Asimov just walked past." And she says, "Seriously? Seriously? You're trying to do an April Fool's joke, and it's just a variation on mine?" I said, "No, he really went past." And she said, "Yeah, right, sure. And because there is a God, Asimov walked back." And I said, "Dr. Asimov, hello." And she's going on. And he says, "Hello again." And she turns to me. And he's walking past. And I went, "Don't screw with me." That was Asimov. I then got to tell him that story when I interviewed him. That was hilarious.
I can imagine you must have appreciated that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've met so many interesting people in my life. I mean, we just lost Leonard Nimoy. I met him several times. I met him in Italy, where we went to a Star Trek convention, and he was one of the guests. And I had not had any opportunity to meet with him, and he was there. Julie Caitlin Brown was involved with bringing him, and and I asked if there was any way that she could set up a time for me to just meet him for a minute, just to say hello. And she talked to him about it, and it turned out he was a fan of mine. He loved my work on Star Trek, so he said, "Absolutely." And I sat and I went to his dressing room. They had a dressing room for him. I chatted with him for about 10 minutes about his photography and about pretty much everything except Star Trek. It was fantastic. And then I wound up being drafted into part of a flying wedge of people that got in front of him to help get him through the crowd of Italian fans out the back exit to his car. So that was fun. The best was Dragon Con a few years ago. He was the recipient of what's called the Julie Award, which is an award for achievement in a multitude of different fields. And it's named after Julie Schwartz. And for some reason, I seem to have become the official person who gives out a Julie Award every year. And I was to give it to Leonard. And I'm up there on the stage giving the introductory speech, which is frequently tongue-in-cheek. I said, who could forget, his wonderful science fiction work in Robot Men from Outer Space, that kind of thing. And sitting at the table near by the front are Leonard, Bill Shatner, and Kate Mulgrew. So I'm like entertaining Star Trek royalty. And I stood there and I said, Leonard's work as Spock has made the character so beloved that when he showed up, in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek, at the screening that I was at, everyone cheered and applauded, even though his appearance made no story sense at all. Leonard starts laughing so hard he almost falls off his chair. But the more interesting reaction was Shatner, whose lips I was able to read, because Shatner was going, "I told you! I told you it made no sense. It made no sense at all. I told you that." And see, he says it too.
Let's talk comics for a bit.
Okay.
What was it like breaking into Marvel? Was that a tough process for you?
Well, it was interesting. I broke into Marvel from the inside, as it were. I was hired as Marvel's assistant direct sales manager, and then eventually sales manager, because my previous job in publishing had been working in the sales department. And I very much enjoyed the job that I had, which was essentially getting the comic books to the, at the time, 17 distributors, now 1, out to all the comic book stores. And I traveled to the comic book stores and meet with people. You know, it was a lot of fun. But I was also interested in writing for Marvel as well, because I was a writer first and foremost, and it seemed like it would be fun to do. And I received nothing but resistance, because at the time there was a division between sales and editorial. Editorial's attitude was, if you are in sales, you have no imagination, because if you had an imagination, you'd be in editorial. So therefore, if you are in sales, you have no imagination. And I tried pitching stories to various editors and got absolutely nowhere. And then there was an editor named Jim Owsley. Now, Jim was Larry Hama's assistant. And Jim was, and there's really no other way to say it, a young, angry black man. Now, the reason that's relevant is that that skewed the way he viewed the world. Right? If anyone came into Larry's office and they needed something and Larry wasn't there, they would turn around and just walk out. Jim took that personally. And the reason I'm saying this is because he told me this. So, you know, I'm not telling tales out of it. He told me this. He would take this personally. I was unaware that any of this was going through his head. So if I walked into Larry and Jim's office and Larry wasn't there, I turned to Jim and said, "Could you help me out with this?" Jim was always thrilled that I would ask him that. He felt as if I respected him as a person. The reason he felt that way was I respected him as a person. I respect everyone as people until they give me reasons not to. Besides, if I need something, I didn't care if it was Larry gave it to me or Jim gave it to me, as long as I got what I needed. And if Jim ever needed anything, he would come to me and I would immediately do whatever I could to help him out. So we had a perfectly good relationship. But he felt like the rest of the world had little to no time or interest in it. And then Jim became promoted to full editor. And he was given the Spider-Man books to edit. And all of a sudden, all of the people who Jim felt had never had any time or interest for him was suddenly all wanted to be his best friend. Why? They all wanted to write Spider-Man. And Jim had very little patience with what he saw as a duplicitous attitude. And I walked into his office and I said, "I have an idea for a Spider-Man story." And he closed the door, he said, "Sit down, hit me with it." And I told him my idea for it, and he said, "That sounds really interesting." And he hired me to write a Spider-Man story, which royally pissed off a number of people in editorial. Then he hired me to write a second Spider-Man story, which infuriated people from editorial. And then he fired Al Milgrom off of Peter Parker and hired me to write Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man. And editorial went batshit crazy. And the major concern was that I was going to use my position in sales to unfairly sell copies of Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and therefore ignore everybody else's work. Something that obviously I never did, right? But that was still the concern. And after a year and a half of my writing it and the sales increasing, thereby, I guess, proving everyone's point for some reason, Owsley had to fire me off the book, essentially because he was convinced, rightly so, that if he did not, then Jim Shooter was going to fire him. So I was fired off the Spectacular Spider-Man. Because the feeling at Marvel was that you can't just have some new writer walk in and write Marvel's flagship character, particularly if he's from sales. And that, I thought, was the end of my writing career at Marvel. And then some months later, Bob Harris walks into my office, and he asks me if I would be interested in writing The Incredible Hulk, which surprised the hell out of me. But it turned out that no one in editorial gave a rat's ass about The Incredible Hulk. Everyone was concerned about Spidey. He's our flagship character. The Incredible Hulk was a character whose sales had stagnated over the succeeding years, and nobody at Marvel wanted to write it. Bob